Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving into the extraordinary life of one of history's most brilliant and controversial figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. This video will not only teach you about his life, but also help you improve your English while learning about one of the most influential men of all time. Imagine rising from a small island to become the ruler of almost all of Europe. Imagine leading massive armies, rewriting the rules of war, and changing the course of history, only to lose it all in a dramatic downfall. Napoleon's story is one of ambition, genius, and ultimate tragedy. But how did he do it? What made him such a great leader? And why did he fail in the end? Stay with us as we uncover the rise and fall of a man whose name still echoes through history. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more incredible historical stories to life. Let's begin with the early days of Napoleon Bonaparte. Today, we're diving deep into the life of one of the most brilliant and controversial figures in history, Napoleon Bonaparte. If you've ever wondered how a young Corsican boy, born on a remote island, rose to dominate nearly all of Europe, then this video is for you. Napoleon was a military genius, a political mastermind, and a man whose ambition knew no limits. But how did he achieve so much? And what led to his dramatic downfall? Stay with us as we uncover the life of the man who changed the course of history. But before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future deep dives into the lives of history's most fascinating figures. Now, let's step back in time and discover the extraordinary life of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's story begins on August 15, 1769, on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, which had only recently been annexed by France. He was born into a modest but noble family, the Bonapartes, who traced their lineage to Italian nobility. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was an ambitious lawyer, while his mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a strict and disciplined woman who played a crucial role in shaping young Napoleon's character. From an early age, Napoleon stood out for his intelligence and determination. He was sent to mainland France at the age of 9 to receive an elite education, first in Autun and later at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. Here, he faced discrimination for his Corsican accent and background, but he used this as fuel to prove himself. He excelled in mathematics and military strategy, setting the stage for his future brilliance on the battlefield. At just 16 years old, Napoleon graduated from the École Militaire, becoming an officer in the French artillery. It was a time of great upheaval in France, with the revolution beginning to shake the foundations of the monarchy. Napoleon, ever ambitious and pragmatic, saw opportunity in the chaos. His first real chance to shine came in 1793 during the siege of Toulon. The city had been taken by British forces, and France desperately needed a bold and strategic mind to reclaim it. Napoleon, though still young and relatively unknown, devised a brilliant artillery strategy that led to a decisive French victory. His success earned him a promotion to brigadier general at just 24 years old, but this was only the beginning. As France descended into further political turmoil, Napoleon's star continued to rise. His tactical genius and leadership skills set him apart, and he quickly gained the attention of the country's most powerful figures. The stage was set for his meteoric rise to power. Now that we've seen the origins of this remarkable figure, let's explore how Napoleon climbed to the very top, seizing control of France and changing the course of history forever. Napoleon's rise to power was nothing short of extraordinary. By the late 1790s, France was in chaos. The French Revolution had overthrown the monarchy, but in its place, the country was ruled by the weak and corrupt Directory. Meanwhile, France was embroiled in wars across Europe, fighting against coalitions of monarchies determined to crush the revolution. It was the perfect environment for an ambitious and brilliant strategist like Napoleon to make his move. Fresh off his success at the siege of Toulon, Napoleon was assigned to lead the French army in Italy in 1796. At just 26 years old, he transformed a poorly equipped and demoralized army into an unstoppable force. His Italian campaign was a masterpiece of military strategy. Using speed, deception, and aggressive tactics, he crushed the Austrian and Piedmontese forces in a series of stunning victories. Town after town fell before him, and in less than a year, he had forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio, securing French dominance in northern Italy. This made Napoleon a national hero, and more importantly, it proved that he was more than just a talented general. He was a leader who could deliver results. But Napoleon's ambition stretched beyond Italy. In 1798, he set his sights on Egypt, hoping to strike a blow at British influence in the region while expanding France's empire. The Egyptian campaign, however, was a mix of triumph and disaster. On land, Napoleon's forces won decisive battles, such as the Battle of the Pyramids, where his modern tactics obliterated the Mamluk cavalry. However, at sea, things took a devastating turn. The British, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, annihilated the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, cutting off Napoleon's forces from returning to France. Despite this setback, Napoleon's time in Egypt solidified his image as a visionary leader. He brought scientists, engineers, and intellectuals with him, leading to significant discoveries, including the Rosetta Stone, which later unlocked the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphs. He also positioned himself as a liberator, attempting to modernize Egypt's administration. But as the situation in France deteriorated, Napoleon saw an opportunity too great to ignore. In 1799, he secretly abandoned his army in Egypt and returned to France. The country was desperate for stability, and many saw Napoleon as the only man capable of restoring order. He quickly aligned himself with powerful political figures and, on November 9, 1799, executed a brilliantly orchestrated coup known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. The Directory was overthrown, and a new government, the Consulate, was established, with Napoleon as first consul, effectively giving him near-dictatorial control over France. At just 30 years old, Napoleon had achieved what few could even dream of. He had seized power over one of the most powerful nations in the world. But his ambition didn't stop there. He had no intention of simply ruling France. He wanted to reshape it entirely and turn it into the dominant force in Europe. Now that Napoleon was in control, the next phase of his journey would begin. He would declare himself emperor, launch reforms that changed France forever, and build an empire that would shake the foundations of the world. With France firmly under his control, Napoleon wasted no time in transforming the nation. His first years as first consul were marked by sweeping reforms that strengthened the government, stabilized the economy, and won him the loyalty of the people. But while he ruled as a civilian leader, his military instincts never faded. He knew that France's enemies, particularly Britain, Austria, and Russia, were still determined to crush the revolution. If France was to survive, and if he was to cement his legacy, he needed absolute power. In 1804, Napoleon made a bold and unprecedented move. He crowned himself Emperor of the French. The ceremony took place in the Grand Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, with Pope Pius VII present to bless the occasion. But in a moment of pure symbolism, Napoleon refused to let the Pope place the crown on his head. Instead, he took it with his own hands and placed it on himself, sending a clear message. His authority was not granted by the Church or by any divine right. It came from his own merit and the will of the people. As emperor, Napoleon embarked on a series of ambitious reforms that reshaped France from the ground up. One of his most lasting achievements was the Napoleonic Code, a legal system that replaced the chaotic and outdated laws of the old regime. The code established equality before the law, protected private property, and modernized the judicial system. Even today, Many countries still base their legal frameworks on Napoleonic principles. He also revolutionized France's education system, creating lycées, state-run schools, to train the next generation of military officers, administrators, and scientists. His goal was clear. He wanted a nation of disciplined, educated citizens who could serve his empire efficiently. Meanwhile, he improved infrastructure, stabilized the currency, and fostered economic growth through industrial and agricultural policies. But Napoleon was not just a reformer. He was a ruler who demanded loyalty. He established a network of spies and censors to suppress dissent, ensuring that opposition to his rule was minimal. While many admired him as a strong and effective leader, others saw him as a dictator who had betrayed the ideals of the revolution. Still, his greatest ambition lay outside of France. He had no intention of ruling a single nation. He wanted an empire that stretched across Europe. His military campaigns would soon shake the continent, bringing him to the height of his power. However, with great power came great enemies, and as Napoleon expanded his reach, the seeds of his eventual downfall were also being sown. Napoleon's rise to emperor was only the beginning. His true ambition was to reshape Europe in his image, and to do that, he needed to dominate the battlefield. Between 1805 and 1812, he led France to an unprecedented series of victories, establishing an empire that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Russia. No other general in history had achieved such dominance in such a short period. One of his most celebrated victories came in 1805 at the Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Facing the combined forces of Austria and Russia, Napoleon executed a masterful strategy of deception. He feigned weakness, luring the enemy into a trap, and then launched a devastating counterattack that shattered their armies. It was a masterpiece of military planning, and it confirmed Napoleon as the greatest general of his time. Fresh off this success, Napoleon turned his attention to Prussia, another major European power. In 1806, at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, he crushed the Prussian army in a matter of days. Berlin fell soon after, and Napoleon marched triumphantly into the city. The Prussian monarchy was humiliated, and the French emperor was now the undisputed master of Western and Central Europe. But his ambitions did not stop there. In 1807, he faced off against the Russian Empire at the Battle of Friedland. Once again, his tactical genius prevailed, forcing Tsar Alexander I to the negotiating table. The result was the Treaty of Tilsit, a moment of glory for Napoleon. Russia, once an enemy, was now forced into an uneasy alliance with France. Meanwhile, Prussia was reduced to a shadow of its former self. Napoleon had redrawn the map of Europe, making himself the ultimate ruler of the continent. At home, Napoleon's victories fueled his popularity. He was seen as a leader who brought France out of revolution and into an era of greatness. But while he was at the peak of his power, he was also making powerful enemies. Britain, which remained undefeated and untouchable across the English Channel, was his greatest frustration. Unable to invade, he devised the Continental System, an economic blockade designed to cripple British trade by cutting it off from European markets. However, this move would eventually backfire, as it hurt France's allies just as much as it hurt Britain, leading to growing resentment against Napoleonic rule. Still, Napoleon seemed unstoppable. His empire had reached its zenith, and he was preparing for his next great conquest. But power is a dangerous thing. It creates enemies, breeds overconfidence, and often leads to a fatal mistake. And for Napoleon, that mistake was just on the horizon. By 1812, Napoleon stood at the pinnacle of his power. He had crushed his enemies on the battlefield, redrawn the map of Europe, and turned France into the greatest empire of its time. But as history has often shown, the higher one rises, the harder the fall. And Napoleon was about to make the greatest mistake of his career, an invasion that would ultimately seal his fate. The trouble began with Russia. Though Tsar Alexander I had agreed to the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, the alliance between France and Russia was never stable. The continental system, Napoleon's blockade against British trade, was hurting Russia's economy, and Alexander refused to fully enforce it. Tensions grew, and by 1812, Napoleon decided that war was inevitable. His solution? A full-scale invasion of Russia. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men from across his empire, known as the Grand Army. Confident in his past successes, he believed that a swift campaign would force Alexander to negotiate. But Russia was unlike any enemy he had faced before. Instead of meeting Napoleon in a decisive battle, the Russians employed a scorched-earth strategy, retreating deeper into their vast territory and destroying everything in their wake. As Napoleon's army advanced, they found only empty villages, burned fields, and no supplies. Then came the fateful Battle of Borodino on September 7, 1812. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars, with over 70,000 casualties. Though Napoleon technically won the battle, it was a hollow victory. The Russian army withdrew, but it was not destroyed, and Napoleon's forces were weakened. Finally, on September 14th, he reached Moscow, only to find the city abandoned and set on fire by the Russians. There were no supplies, no shelter, and no clear path forward. Napoleon had taken Moscow, but he had won nothing. As winter approached, Napoleon faced a brutal reality. He could not stay in Moscow, and his army was running out of food. On October 19th, he gave the order to retreat. What followed was one of the most disastrous military retreats in history. The Russian winter was merciless. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit, and starvation, disease, and relentless Cossack attacks decimated the Grand Army. By the time Napoleon's shattered forces limped out of Russia in December, fewer than 100,000 men remained. The catastrophe in Russia shattered Napoleon's aura of invincibility. Sensing weakness, his enemies formed the Sixth Coalition: Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, all united to bring him down. In 1813, Napoleon fought desperately to hold his empire together, but the tide had turned against him. At the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, he suffered another devastating defeat. His allies began to abandon him, and soon, France itself was under invasion. By early 1814, Paris had fallen. Napoleon's once loyal generals urged him to surrender. On April 6th, he was forced to abdicate. The once mighty emperor of the French was now in exile, sent to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. His empire had crumbled, and Europe celebrated his downfall. But Napoleon was not finished yet. He had one last gamble to play, one final bid to reclaim his throne. For most men, exile would have been the end of the story. But Napoleon Bonaparte was not most men. In less than a year after his forced abdication, he was already plotting his return. The situation in France had changed dramatically. The Bourbon monarchy had been restored under King Louis XVIII, but the new king was unpopular. Many in France, especially the soldiers who had once served under Napoleon, longed for his return. And so, in March 1815, Napoleon made a daring move that would go down in history as one of the greatest political and military gambles of all time. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with a small band of loyal followers and landed on the southern coast of France. With just 1,000 men, he began his march toward Paris. The government sent troops to stop him, but something remarkable happened. Instead of arresting him, they joined him. When he finally confronted a regiment sent to capture him, he boldly stepped forward and declared, "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, I am your emperor. If any of you will shoot your emperor, do it now." Instead of opening fire, the soldiers erupted in cheers. The king's forces collapsed, and within weeks, Napoleon had retaken Paris without firing a single shot. The period that followed is known as the 100 Days, Napoleon's dramatic last attempt to reclaim his empire. But the rest of Europe was not about to let him rise again. Almost immediately, the Allied powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, formed the Seventh Coalition and prepared for war. Napoleon, knowing he was outnumbered, moved quickly. His only hope was to strike first and defeat his enemies before they could fully unite. In June 1815, Napoleon launched his final campaign in Belgium. His goal was to break the coalition by defeating the British forces under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. On June 16th, he won his last victory at the Battle of Ligny, defeating the Prussians. But a critical mistake followed. His forces failed to fully destroy them, allowing the Prussians to regroup. Meanwhile, another battle was brewing just a few miles away. 2 days later, on June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced the British army at the Battle of Waterloo. It was a defining moment in history. The battle was brutal and lasted for hours, with French and British forces locked in a desperate struggle. Napoleon's strategy was to break the British lines before Prussian reinforcements could arrive. But Wellington's troops held firm, and by late afternoon, Blücher's Prussians appeared on the battlefield. The tide turned against Napoleon. As the sun set, his once mighty army collapsed, and the dream of restoring his empire was shattered. Realizing all was lost, Napoleon fled the battlefield. He returned to Paris, but the government had already turned against him. With no army left and no political support, he had no choice but to abdicate once again, this time for good. On July 15th, he surrendered to the British, hoping for mercy. But there would be no second exile to a comfortable island near France. This time, his enemies wanted him gone forever. Now a prisoner of the British, Napoleon was sent to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, over 1,800 kilometers from the nearest continent. Isolated from the world he once ruled, his reign was truly over. But his legacy was just beginning. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once ruled over Europe, was now a prisoner on a tiny volcanic island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. St. Helena was nothing like Elba. There was no chance of escape, no loyal army waiting to welcome him back. The British ensured that their greatest enemy would never threaten the world again. The island was harsh, isolated, and surrounded by constant surveillance. Napoleon, now 46 years old, was cut off from the world he had once commanded. His final years on St. Helena were marked by boredom, frustration, and declining health. He spent his time dictating his memoirs, reflecting on his life, and rewriting history in his favor. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood hero, a man who had fought not for his own glory, but for the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Whether or not this was true, it didn't matter. His words would shape his legacy for generations to come. As the years passed, his health deteriorated. He suffered from chronic stomach pain, which some historians believe was caused by stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. Others speculated that he was slowly being poisoned by arsenic, but no definitive proof has ever been found. What is certain is that by early 1821, Napoleon was dying. On May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, he took his last breath. His final words were said to be, "France Army, Head of the Army Josephine," a final tribute to the country, the soldiers, and the woman he had loved. Napoleon was buried on St. Helena, but his story did not end there. As time passed, his legend grew. In 1840, his remains were brought back to France in a grand ceremony, and he was reburied in the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris, where his tomb remains to this day. He had gone from being a prisoner of Europe to a symbol of French pride and military genius. But Napoleon's legacy is more than just his military conquests. He changed the world in ways that are still felt today. His Napoleonic Code influenced the legal systems of many countries. His military strategies are studied by generals around the world. His impact on nationalism, governance, and warfare shaped the modern era. Even in his defeat, Napoleon had achieved something extraordinary. He had ensured that his name would never be forgotten. Few figures in history have left such a powerful and controversial legacy. To some, Napoleon was a tyrant who sacrificed millions for his own ambition. To others, he was a visionary who brought order, stability, and progress to a chaotic world. Love him or hate him, one thing is certain: Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the most extraordinary figures in human history. And so, his story ends. But his legend? That will last forever.